handout. Going to try to finish up what we started last week, but sometimes, okay. Mainly just so you have the picture on the back to look at. I couldn't read that picture if my life depended on it. All right, so Acts chapter 21, and let's drop down here, beginning with verse number 15, and we'll look down through verse number 26. And after those days, we took up our carriages, that means luggage, and went up to Jerusalem. There went with us also certain of the disciples of Caesarea, and brought with them one Manason of Cyprus, an old disciple. I think that's kind of funny the way that's worded. An old disciple with whom we should lodge. And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And the day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord, and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. And they are informed of thee that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. What is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. Do thou therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Them take, and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing. But that thou thyself also walkest orderly and keepest the law. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such things, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. Father, would you take these few moments as we discuss the will of God? And Lord, I pray that you would work in us to desire to seek your will and to pursue it in our lives. And I pray that we would take from the example of the Apostle Paul, and that you would stir us and help us to see the manner in which we're to pursue your will. Please help me as I teach your word. Pray that you'd bless our time together in Jesus' name. Amen. So as we mentioned last week, just kind of a brief review of what we have gone over already. One of the greatest problems I think we see among Christians is not so much an ignorance of knowing God's will. It's just really people don't want to do God's will. We know what God tells us to do. We know. I mean, if it's written in the Bible, especially if it's in the New Testament, that's God's will for us. Very clear. And the reason we don't do it is not that we're ignorant of it. I mean, there might be some people that are ignorant of it. Maybe they're a new Christian or something like that. But largely, it's just because we flat out don't want to do it. But this is certainly not the case with the Apostle Paul. Paul was a zealot in his pursuit of God and seeking to do what's pleasing to him. Paul is not ignorant of God's will. We know from the next chapter, in chapter 22, Paul recounts his testimony and how Ananias came to him when he was in Damascus and laid hands on him, and he said that God has chosen you to know his will. And so very clearly, Paul knew and understood what the will of God is. And so now, as we follow Paul's journey here in this chapter, as he's going to Jerusalem, we're seeing what the requirements are for accomplishing God's will in our life. And so we see first off in the trip from Miletus to Tyre, we get a little bit of information about this. In verse 1, Paul is leaving from Miletus to begin his trip to Jerusalem. And so we're not going to read all these verses. We'll read a couple of them. But if you want to just even follow the map on the back. So they leave from Miletus, And they go to Kos in verse 1, Kos, Rhodes, Patara, and they're sailing along the coast of what is modern-day Turkey, basically, today. And so they're on a small ship, and this is going to take forever, and Paul wants to speed things up. He wants to get to Jerusalem. And so they find, while they're at Patara, they find a ship, a larger ship, that is going to go straightway with a straight course to Phoenicia. And that's verse 2, exactly where they go. And as they go along, they go south of Cyprus, but they go straight across to Phoenicia, landing at Tyre, where they are to unload. And so then verse 4, while they're at Tyre, it says, verse 4, finding disciples, we tarried there 7 days, who said to Paul, through the Spirit, that we should not go up to Jerusalem. And so this is where the controversy is when we come to this chapter. Because we look at the Apostle Paul, and up to this point, Paul has been the man. And there's some people, they think, okay, once Paul gets to this point, Paul just really drops the ball when it comes to his pursuit of God and godliness. And now Paul gets out of the will of God here, and that's why he ends up going to Jerusalem, and that's why he ends up getting arrested and persecuted, and then eventually he loses his head. Well, I don't think so, because, there's several reasons. Paul was all about seeking the will of God. Paul knows God's will. So what exactly is going on here? I think the context here shows us that Paul is not out of the will of God, but he is actually pursuing the will of God and is being prepared for accomplishing that will. Because notice here, they're here for 7 days at Tyre. The reason they're there for 7 days is because they were told by these disciples, through the Spirit, not to go to Jerusalem. But then notice verse 5, when we had accomplished those days. So notice that word accomplish there. That means they fulfilled something. What did they fulfill? Not going to Jerusalem for those 7 days. That is just real simple. So it wasn't an determined thing, don't go to Jerusalem ever. It was just, right now, don't go to Jerusalem. Probably, since Paul got on a different ship, Paul's ahead of schedule. Everything has to work exactly right. I mentioned in Sunday school Sunday that been kind of wrestling with this issue in Romans 9 and dealing with Calvinism and Arminianism and the sovereignty of God and providence. And so the last couple of weeks I've really been studying those subjects out. And my wife asked me the other day, are you losing hair in the front? I'm like, well, now that I think about it, maybe after that. But when it comes to Calvinism, Calvinists have this idea that God meticulously has determined every single thing that happens. So when you were on your way to church tonight, and you were driving the car down the road, and you drove over some gravel, according to the Calvinists, God meticulously determined that that stone be there, and that your tire hit it at the specific time that it hit it, at the specific speed that it hit it, and that piece of gravel rolled wherever it rolled when you went over it. I mean, just getting down to the minutest detail, that all of that had to be determined. And they think that by God determining every single particular event and every move that everybody's going to make, that somehow makes him a big God. Well, I guess you could look at it that way. Kind of seems, I want to be careful because I don't want to misrepresent or even sound blasphemous, but that actually seems like a puny God, that he would have to meticulously govern every single specific detail of everything in order to be in control and to win. I used to play chess when I was younger, when I was a teenager. I never got really good at it. I got okay. Maybe a novice at best, so just okay. And the guy that was training me and teaching me how to play, he was really good. And he used to go online, and you could watch all these people online, and they would play against master chess players and stuff like that. And it was really impressive. But you've either seen it in a movie or you've been to a park where they have all these chess boards, and you'll have 10 or 15 different chess matches going on at the same time. And sometimes you'll even have one guy who's a chess master, and he can play all of these guys He just kind of goes down the tables, and then he starts over again and goes back down the tables. Now, there are two ways that he could win. One, he could tie the hands of the people behind them and move for them, or tell them where to move so as to set things up exactly to where he wins. Or he can just be better and smarter and know everything that they're going to do and be 15,000 moves ahead of them. Which one's more powerful? Who's the better chess player? The guy that's just, he's so good, it doesn't matter what you do, I'm already 10 steps ahead of you, I'm already into the future, I know what you're going to do already, and so I'm going to win anyhow. I'll maneuver this thing around to make sure that I win. And this is exactly what's going on here with Paul. Had Paul gotten to Jerusalem early, things would not have been set up the way they needed to be for him to deliver the gift, for him to take these men to the temple for cleansing, and for the people to be there that are going to betray him, and for the people to be there to arrest him, and then for him to be the testimony to the Jewish people, and then get to Rome on Rome's tab. Had he not gotten there at just the right time, what's happening? God's maneuvering Paul. He's moving things around, and he's orchestrating situations to slow Paul down. That's exactly what's happening. And so these people here, these people at Tyrus, they say, don't go to Jerusalem for 7 days. So, verse 5, when we accomplished those days, we departed and went our way. And they all brought us on our way with wives and children till we were out of the city, and we kneeled down on the shore and prayed. And so this is the first requirement to accomplishing God's will, as we said last week. You must depend upon God. You can't accomplish anything for God if you're not depending upon Him. Otherwise, you're just accomplishing it for yourself. It's all flesh. Does God accept our flesh? If we walk after the flesh, can we please God? No. No. Romans 8 is very clear about that. I do think it's interesting that the only time children are mentioned in the book of Acts, it's here at this prayer meeting that's taking place. But what we find here is we find an example that they understood their dependence upon God. I think that's something that we often forget about. We're really good about making plans. I am. And I don't share all my plans and my thoughts about things that I'm planning. But I have plans about things, and sometimes I have to remind myself, oh, wait, maybe you should pray about that. That might not be a good idea. It sounds good, but we're really quick. We get an idea, especially us guys. We get an idea, and it's like, man, that's a great idea. Let's just do it. Well, have we stopped to pray about it? Not stopped to think about it. Not stopped to ask questions about it. I mean, we need to do those things too. But have we stopped to pray about it? Really, the prospect of anything that we're about to do should motivate us to seek God into prayer. Because we are totally dependent upon God for everything. We need to seek His blessing. So then Paul's going to leave Tyre. In verses 7 to 14, he's going to travel to Caesarea. And so, verse 7, from Tyre, they came to Ptolemais. Verse 8, they came unto Caesarea and entered into the house of Philip the evangelist and abode with him. And the last time these two met, or at least that's recorded in Scripture, 20 years have passed since the last time. And Philip was running away from Paul for his life. And now he's going to stay in his house. And so while Paul is with Philip, he's going to receive another warning. He's going to receive another direct message from God not to go to Jerusalem yet. I mean, he's not that far away. He's a couple days' walk, and it's just real quick. And so, verse 9. Same man had 4 daughters, virgins, which did prophesy. Now, it doesn't tell us exactly, explicitly what they said. I'll admit that. But I think it's pretty clear from the context what's going on. Because when Paul was in Tyrus, and they said, don't go to Jerusalem, what did he do? He stayed for 7 days. And then after those 7 days, then he went and picked up his journey. And here we have the exact same thing going on. Verse 10, it says, and as we tarried there many days, there came down from Judea a certain prophet named Agabus. Then when you get to verse 12 and 13, they know, okay, it's time to go. And so what's happened? They get to Philip's house. Philip's daughter's prophesying and says, it's not time to go to Jerusalem yet. You need to wait a while. And this time, they don't know how long specifically until Agabus comes. And so they tarry there many days, and then when Agabus comes, Agabus is the indication that now it's time to move on and finish this trip to Jerusalem. And the way we know this is because Agabus came on the scene first in Acts chapter 11 to the church at Antioch to tell them there's going to be a famine and a dearth that's going to take place, and the people of Israel are going to be without their necessities. And so the church at Antioch takes up a big collection, and then as a result of that prophecy of Agabus, they go to Jerusalem to deliver that gift. And that's exactly what Paul is doing. He's bringing another gift for the poor saints at Jerusalem. And so Agabus coming in, telling Paul, takes his belt off of him. That's just kind of weird, I think. I wonder if that was awkward. But he takes his belt off him, he ties up his hands and feet with Paul's belt and says, this is what's going to happen to the man who owns this belt. And you know what you don't see Paul doing? You know, Luke, didn't I borrow that belt from you the other day? That's Luke's belt. That is not what he does. He's totally ready to accept the responsibility and all the consequences of going to Jerusalem. He understands, I'm going to do the will of God. It's time to go now, and so we're going to go. So verse 12 says, when we heard these things, both we and they of that place besought him not to go up to Jerusalem. So Luke's even getting involved with this. Those of his team are getting involved with this. Paul, please don't go. Verse 13, then Paul answered, what mean ye to weep and to break my heart? For I am ready not to be bound only, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus. This is the second requirement for accomplishing God's will. You have to be determined to finish. Now, there's a lot of people that start out to do what God wants them to do, but they don't have the determination to finish. And Paul says, you know what? It doesn't matter to me if I die. I'm going to finish my course. This is the course that God has given me. He says it back in chapter 20. I want to finish my course with joy and the ministry that I've received of the Lord Jesus to testify the gospel of the grace of God. That's what I'm planning to do. That's what I'm doing, going to Jerusalem with this gift. I want to testify the gospel of the grace of God. I'm going to finish my course, and if I die at Jerusalem, then I have finished my course. That's the attitude, or supposed to be the attitude, of normal Christianity. That's really the attitude every one of us should have when it comes to doing God's will. When it comes to preaching the gospel to people. Who cares if they don't like me? Now, I say that. None of us like rejection. None of us like rejection. In fact, I would be perfectly content. You can ask my wife. I am a very quiet and introverted person. I go into a crowd of people, I know, it's hard to believe, but my natural tendency is to get back in the corner somewhere where nobody's going to talk to me. My goal in being there is to be invisible and be as good at it as possible, because I know that if I begin to interact with people, I had this problem when I was growing up, that every time I opened my mouth, I was making somebody mad. And eventually it got old. It's just like, fine, I just won't say anything. And so nobody likes rejection. Nobody likes to be the guy that ticks everyone off. We like to be accepted by people. We want to be buddy-buddy with people. We want to kind of get in and be part of the group, and then to do or say something that could possibly separate you from that group, that's intimidating. To know that there's things at stake, and as you get older, I think sometimes it's more difficult for me now, in some ways, that I'm older and have more responsibility than when I was a teenager to engage people with the gospel. When I was a teenager, I didn't care who you were. I would just go down to the fair and I'd stand up and I would do crazy, stupid stuff. And just all sorts of stuff when I was in college and everything like that. But you get a little bit older, and there's more at stake for doing those things. If I get arrested, the temptation is, I better not do that because I could get in trouble with the police and they could arrest me. Okay, well, as a teenager, that's not that big of a deal. But as an adult, there's stuff at stake for that, right? I mean, not that I would mind having the only thing on my record, preaching the gospel. They probably wouldn't put it that way in there, but that's what it would be for. Well, but Paul has the attitude that if I die, that's fine. In fact, really, this is exactly what Jesus told us it would cost us to follow him in Matthew 16. It's there in your notes. If any man will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And so Jesus says that to be his disciple, to come after him, we must take up our cross. And what is that cross? It is an instrument of death. It means to be willing and so committed to him that I'm going to follow him even to the point of death if that's what it requires. Whosoever shall save his life shall lose it. Whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. And so Paul is simply following through on his command. This is how he enlisted. When he was there on the Damascus Road and Jesus appears to him, he knows exactly what's on the table. His life was on the table from the very moment he met Jesus. And the Apostle Paul, we see that he lived a life of continuously laying down his life. He says, we are always delivered unto death for Jesus' sake. What does that mean? He says, I die daily. It means every day I get up and I know this could very well be the last day. I'm putting my life out there. And that's okay. And so he's lived his life this way, and now that death is officially a prospect. That doesn't faze him. Like, I've been doing it for the last 20 years, every single day, and this is no different. This is just like it was any other time. You know, when you die 3 times, death's off. You know, you're stoned to death 2 or 3 times. It's just like, you know, I already know what's coming. I know what's going to happen. You know, there's times where the will of God's not going to make sense. It's not going to make sense to others. People may oppose us. People we respect and love may not approve of what we're doing, and even with good intentions, they will oppose us, and we see that right here with the Apostle Paul. Luke and the team that's been traveling with Paul for all these years are begging Paul, don't go to Jerusalem. They've got good intentions. It's not like they're purposing, thinking, man, you know, we just need to get Paul to not do the will of God here. That's not their intention. That's not what they're thinking. And so they have good intentions. There may be times where we don't even feel right about it ourselves. And we really need to be careful about that. That just because you have a feeling, you feel good about something, doesn't mean it's the will of God. And just because you don't feel good about something doesn't mean it's not the will of God. As if God's not going to tell us to do something we don't quite have peace about or feel good about. And here's Paul going to Jerusalem and knowing that he's going to be bound and beaten. I'm sure Paul had just butterflies in his stomach about that. And so a disciple of Jesus must go and do what God commands no matter the danger involved. And so, verse 14, we see Paul. When he would not be persuaded, we cease, saying, the will of the Lord be done. And again, just to reiterate, as Paul's going here, and there's these delays, it looks like. Holy Spirit's just preparing Paul for what's coming. He's working to get Paul into Jerusalem at just the right time, verse 15. So after those days, those many days, we took up our carriages. It almost sounds like Luke is maybe excited here. Why would you even include this detail? It seems like that would go without saying. It says we packed. That's what the carriages means. It means we packed up our luggage. And we went up to Jerusalem. And there was with us also, verse 16, certain of the disciples of Caesarea, so a group of people from the church there comes down with him, and brought with them Manason of Cyprus, an old disciple with whom we should lodge. Apparently this man Manason is from Jerusalem, but he was born in Cyprus and was staying at Caesarea for whatever reason. And so he's gone back with them, and then they're going to lodge while they're in Jerusalem with Mnason. And Mnason, he's a Hellenistic Jew by his name, and so this would be convenient for them. He would have been the one most comfortable housing Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, unlike many of the Jews in Jerusalem would. Verse 17, when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. In the day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. So this James is James the Lord's brother. He was the leader of the church of Jerusalem at this time. With the other elders, James was probably, I guess, if you want to equate it to something today, kind of like a senior pastor type figure at this point. Remember, at the beginning of the book of Acts, it was the apostle Peter who is basically the spokesman for the group, for the church. He's the main speaker, he's the main preacher, he's the one doing all the teaching. But then, chapter 4, he's arrested, and then somewhere between chapter 4 and chapter 10, there's a transition that's taking place where James is going to begin to take the lead because the apostle Peter is going to begin to work out away from Jerusalem. So we find in chapter 10, he goes to the house of Cornelius. He's actually down in Joppa ministering down there. Later on, about 30 years later after this, when he's writing his epistles, he's in Babylon preaching to the Jews there. So it'd be kind of hard for him to pastor the church when he's not there. And so James is the one who begins to take the lead. And so here's where we see the third requirement for accomplishing God's will in this coming passage, is that you must demonstrate humility. This was a key to Paul's success. He was a humble man. He did not, we find him talking about himself in some of his epistles, but you can tell when he says those things, he did not like to talk about himself. He just wanted to be out of the picture. And so we see that Paul demonstrates his humility two ways. Number one, Paul does not take credit for the work that he's done. He doesn't take any credit for it. He knows this isn't me doing this. Notice verse 19. And when he had saluted them, talking about the elders of the church, he declared particularly what things he had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. Is that what it says? No, what does it say? What things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry or by his service. See, that was Paul's attitude. I'm just a servant. I'm just a servant. Now, that word particularly, there it means each one. So, Paul's been doing this now for, let's see here, this would be about 20 years Paul's been doing this. That's a long time to try to recount. But it says that Paul told them, he declared particularly, or each one of the things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. So this would have been some meeting. I mean, this is the ultimate missionary presentation. You know, imagine one of our missionaries that's been on when like the Fries came back and is like, yeah, we were on the mission field for 30 years. Here's day one. And like, now this is what God did. We got this year, God did this, and then recounting all of it, this is exactly what Paul is doing. He's gone into detail. He's telling everything that God had done. It would be easy for Paul to take the credit. And I think we even take the credit sometimes. I know I do, and I don't mean to, and I think we do it. When we do it, I think we're not intending to, but it's very easy for us to say, I did this or I did that. No. God, look what God did. Look what God did with this situation or with this person. I just happened to get in on it. By his grace, he let me be a part of what's going on here. And this is exactly what Paul's doing. He demonstrates his humility by acknowledging that it is God who did everything. I am just his servant. Keep your place here. Go over to 1 Corinthians. Paul says this again in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. And, you know, the Corinthians, they were divided because they kind of had this hero-type mentality of certain speakers, and they had elevated these men to a higher status than what they should have been elevated to. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, notice here, verse number 5, Who then is Paul, and who is Apollos, but ministers by whom you believed, even as the Lord gave to every man? Now, ministers there is galley slaves. We're the ones at the bottom of the boat rowing this thing. There's nothing prestigious about what we do. We have the job that nobody else wants. That's all we are. I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase. Now he that planteth and he that watereth are one, and every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor. And so Paul says, we're nothing. I planted, just a field servant. I planted. Apollos came through and watered. It's God that gave the increase. It's God that worked in the hearts of people, convicting them, softening their hearts, opening their understanding to receive the gospel. That was all God. We didn't do that. And I think something to keep in mind is that not all of us are going to be reapers. And that would be fun, wouldn't it? Every time you talk to somebody about Jesus, they get saved. That would be wonderful to be on that end of it. The reality is, most of us, we're going to be sowers and waterers. And somebody else is going to have the privilege of reaping. And that's okay. Because those people that reap would not have had that opportunity if we're not sowing and watering. And it's very easy for us to get the attitude, well, I told them once, should have got it. Let me ask you this. If you went out to your garden and you planted a seed, well, I planted a seed. What did you do after that? Well, it's been 5 years. It should have taken root by now. Well, if you don't water it, if you don't put the stuff on it, what's going to happen? It's just going to sit there and do nothing. And it can be very easy for us to get the attitude when we give the gospel to somebody, well, I gave them the gospel. Yeah, well, did you water it? Well, so-and-so gave them the gospel. Did you water it? Did you say something else to them? Did you bug them about it and remind them? This is exactly what Paul's saying. He says, I'm the one that planted. I put the seed in the ground. Apollos came through after me, and he watered the thing and kept watering. And then God gave the increase. We're nothing. But how did God bring about that increase? It was because there was sowing and watering that was taking place. And sometimes, and probably often, we're not going to be the ones to see the people get saved. But we did contribute. I was talking to Harold a couple weeks ago, and he was so excited. He came into church, and he says, he wanted to tell me, I'm sure this is okay to say because it's a good report, right? It's not a bad report. But he came up to me, and he said, hey, somebody, years ago, I gave them our daily bread. And there's the gospel in there and stuff like that. And so he gave it to this woman, and it's been like 20 years since he's seen this person. And he said, I just ran into them the other day. And she thanked me for giving that because through that, reading that, she came to Christ, and now they're actively involved in their church and ministries. And it's like you have no idea. Just something that simple, handing it off to somebody, the fruit that it's going to bear later on, because he didn't get to be there to reap it. But what did he do? He planted the seed. Somebody else came along and watered. And fruit came as a result. It gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. I love those type of stories. For Paul, he's just merely a tool in God's hands. God can do with me what he wants. I'm just a tool. God's the one that does it all. So Paul's not being stubborn. He's not being arrogant about going to Jerusalem. He's being a humble servant of the Lord, doing exactly what God has called him to do. Second, so the first is that he did not take the credit for the work that was being done. Second, he demonstrates his humility by a willingness to sacrifice. His willingness to sacrifice. Notice verse 20. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. Now, I think this is really remarkable because remember, back in Acts chapter number 7, 8, and 9, Paul has basically blown up the church. It was scattered. They went everywhere preaching the word. It says except the apostles. So I mean, like all the Christians left town. Now there is many thousands. So while Paul's going around preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, the church of Jerusalem is having a population explosion taking place. And so there are many thousands that have come to Christ, that are following their Messiah. Some people estimate that upwards of 30,000 people were a part of the church of Jerusalem. That would be incredible. A logistical nightmare, but that would be incredible. And so these people, these elders, as they're sitting there listening to what the Apostle Paul is saying, they get excited. I mean, they begin to glorify the word of the Lord. They hear everything that God has done using the Apostle Paul, and it's like, yeah, praise the Lord. Now there is this matter that we need to talk about. Let's just get down to business here, Paul. We got a problem. There are many thousands of Jews, it says, that are zealous of the law. This means that they remain faithful to all the ceremonial aspects of the law of the Old Testament. They're keeping the feasts, they're keeping the Sabbaths, they're keeping the vows, they're keeping the dietary restrictions. Why are they doing this? I mean, we've been going over this for several Sundays. Why are they doing this? I mean, one, these are customs that were established by God. I mean, we understand the dispensational distinction that took place at the cross and these things being set aside, and the old covenant is no longer in force, according to the book of Hebrews. And so I think we understand that. But these are people that were distinguished as God's people because of these laws. And in keeping these laws, now it is enhanced. Now that they're following the Messiah, their understanding of what these things pictured has been enhanced and greatly heightened. And it's bringing about a new excitement, because as they do these things, these aren't just rituals that we're doing anymore. We actually understand what God means by this. You know, prior to this, they're doing the Passover, and all they're thinking about is maybe coming out of Egypt. Maybe, why do we keep doing all these different aspects of the Passover and stuff like that? But now after you come to Christ, you understand what the Passover is all about. That Christ is the Passover. And so doing this is a wonderful picture of the gospel. And then you have the Day of Atonement, another picture of the gospel. And so they have these constant reminders as part of their culture. And so they weren't going to abandon these things. Also, I mean, how are they as Jewish people going to reach the Jewish people if they're not keeping these things? And this is exactly why Paul does what he does here in Jerusalem. Verse 21. He says, "And they are informed of thee," talking about these many thousands of Jews. James says, "Paul, they've all been told about you, that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs." Now, is this what Paul was teaching? No, Paul wasn't teaching this. These are probably the Judaizers that have been going around. I mean, all the time that Paul is going around, especially through the region of Galatia, even we find in Corinth, these Judaizers are just following and dogging his tracks, going right behind him, saying, now look, it's great that you Gentiles are following the Messiah, but you need to be circumcised, keep the law of Moses if you want to be saved. It's not enough to just believe in Jesus. And so this is exactly what they're doing here. They're trying to discredit the ministry of the Apostle Paul. Because if Paul, especially as a Jewish person, is telling these Jews, don't circumcise your children, don't keep the law of Moses, you can just forsake that and be okay, that's a good way to lose his credibility with them. And that's exactly what their purpose is. If this were what Paul was teaching, what kind of influence would he have had among the Jews and even among the Jewish Christians? Because then how do we witness to our own people? Remember what Paul says there in 1 Corinthians 9. We finished up last week. He says, to the Jew, I became as a Jew. To them that are under the law, as under the law. And so we know from 1 Corinthians 8 to 10, and Romans 14, Paul has no problem with Jewish Christians wanting to observe these customs and these laws, as long as they did not think it was contributing to their salvation or their righteousness. And that's fine. How else could these Jews be a witness? They couldn't be. And obviously Paul's not opposed to these Jewish customs, because Acts 16 he has Timothy circumcised so he can be a witness to the Jews. In Acts 18, Paul has a Jewish vow, a Nazirite vow, and shaves his head at Synchrea. So James knows Paul's stance on this, but it wouldn't be enough for James to tell all these thousands of people, look, that's just not what Paul believes. There has to be some kind of a demonstration. There needs to be something they can see that's going to be proof positive that Paul is not teaching this. And so, verse 22. What is it, therefore? What are we going, in essence, what are we going to do about this? Paul, here's the problem. They've been informed of this. What are we going to do about it? Got an idea. The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. Paul, you're a controversial guy. And once everybody finds out you're here, they're going to want to come together and see you. And they're all going to ask. So let's just cut to the chase, because that would take too long for 30,000 people to ask you, what do you believe about this? Let's just do this. Verse 23. Do therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Them take and purify thyself with them, and be at charge with them, that they may shave their heads. Now, we know here that they're shaving their heads, so this is a Nazirite vow that is taking place. And so with this Nazirite vow, it was for a particular period of time. Now, had Paul gotten to Jerusalem when he wanted to, probably 30 days prior, instead of being stalled at Tyre, stalled at Caesarea, he wouldn't have been here in time for these men to be done with their vow. He would have come too early. But now he's here right at the right time. And so the reason he had to spend that time there, 7 days at Tyre, 1 day in Ptolemais, many days with Philip, is because he has to go to the temple to perform this rite, so he's seen and arrested. This is how this is going to work out. Now, here in your notes, the warnings that Paul had received along the way, as they were preparing him for this event, were also slowing him down so he would be there at the right time. All this had to work out just right. Verse 24, them take, purify thyself with them. Now, why is Paul having to purify himself? This isn't a reference to him taking this Nazirite vow, because that would have taken too much time. It had to be for an extended period of time. And so the idea here is that he's been traveling around Gentile territories, so he is ceremonially unclean, according to the Jews. So now he's coming into wanting to go into the Jewish temple. He has to go through a purification rite to be cleansed, so he can be ceremonially clean to perform this act. And so he's going to be at charges with them. He's going to pay for their sacrifice. He's going to pay, in essence, the temple tax for them to have their head shaved, and for their purification, and for their offering to be made, that they may shave their heads. And all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself walkest orderly and keepest the law. Now, Paul had every right as a believer not to participate. He could have just said, no, I'm at liberty. I don't have to do this. I don't have to keep those ceremonial laws. They don't have the same meaning that they used to. He didn't do it when he was around the Gentiles. He only did it when he was around the Jews. But rather than demand his rights, as we talked about on Sunday, he has sacrificed them in order to be an effective witness. He was able to bend some in order to have the hearing of these people. So this is the proof that Paul's not teaching against the law, or that the Jews should not observe the law. And what we find is that at this period of time in the book of Acts, God's very tolerant towards the Jewish people, but Jewish believers in particular, to keep these ceremonies going. But it's only going to be temporary. There is going to be a time, and Hebrews talks about it, says that which decayeth and waxeth old, talking about these old covenant things, is ready to perish and vanish away. What's it talking about? When the temple's destroyed. The temple's going to be destroyed, and all of it's going to be obsolete. There's not going to be a temple. There's not going to be a priesthood. There's not going to be anybody to do these sacrifices. All of it's going to go away. In fact, as Paul writes the book of Hebrews, he's telling these Hebrew Christians, stop acting like Hebrews. Don't go back to those things. So Paul's not teaching it now, but when Paul writes the book of Hebrews, he is teaching it. Teaching them, don't go back to those things. So verse 25, James affirms what happened at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. As touching the Gentiles which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. Now, fornication, that seems like an obvious thing. Remember, fornication has varying degrees of understanding depending on the context it's in. Now, that Jerusalem Council, this is what this is being taken from. They were quoting from, I think it's Leviticus 17 and 18. And Leviticus 17 and 18, one of the things that's forbidden there is the marriage of near kin. Now, we don't typically grow up with that unless you're from the South. Because you don't marry your cousin because you're going to have kids that don't have teeth or something like that. But this was something that the Gentiles did, and it was fine. God didn't have a problem with it, but he told the Jews not to do that. And so they tell the Gentiles, don't do these things. And there were 613 laws that God could have said, just keep the Old Testament, just keep the covenant, and you'll be fine. But instead he says, keep these 4 commands. Don't eat things strangled, sacrificed unto idols, or blood, and keep yourself from fornication. Why? It tells them in Acts 15. It's because in every city, there's people that have Moses read to them every Sabbath day. Tell these Gentiles, don't do these things. That way you're not an offense to the Jewish people. That way you can be an effective witness to them. Verse 26. And Paul threw a fit. Said, I'm not going to do it. What does it say? Then Paul took the men. And the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. What does Paul do? He has totally yielded up his rights. You know what? If this is what I need to do to have my credibility among these people, and to be able to be an effective witness to these people and minister to them, I think it's interesting because Paul has gone through Macedonia and Achaia collecting up this offering for the church of Jerusalem. And he spends 2 or 3 years prepping for this offering. And so it's something substantial. But when he comes to Jerusalem for the purpose of delivering this offering, nothing is mentioned in this chapter about delivering the offering. Nothing said about it. I think that's fascinating. Why? Because there is something even more important, and that is that Paul be an effective witness to these people. And the only way he's going to do that is if he humbly sacrifices his rights in order to have the credibility of the people. That offering would have been worthless if Paul would have gone to the temple as a Jewish man. Some take this as a compromise on Paul's part. This is not a compromise. They think that, well, Paul sinned by going to Jerusalem, and now he's just kind of compounding his sin because now he's compromising and going to the temple. That's not what's going on here. Paul desires to be a credible witness to these Jews, both to the unsaved and to the saved ones that are there, the church of Jerusalem. He doesn't want to lose his testimony to them. That's going to be pretty important later on when he writes the book of Hebrews to them. If we're going to do God's will, it's going to require 3 things. It's going to require an absolute dependence upon God, a relentless determination to finish, and it's going to require humility. It's going to require that we give God the glory for the service that's done. It's going to require that we give up our rights and make sacrifices, sometimes things that are very uncomfortable to us so that we can be an effective witness for Him. All right. Let's go ahead and take up some